Okay, so we have now looked at the peer idolization scale and the 21 points. Now I also want you to see that as a ladder. There's going to be a reason for that upcoming further along in this module. And as we know, a ladder has steps gradually going up, and that's a very important concept for you to keep in your mind. Now we're going to move into the second area, which is the two environments that a child can live in. So we've got the peer idolization scale with the connection section going from 0 to +10 and the disconnection section going from 0 down to -10. But here, in this area, these two environments for a child, we're not going to necessarily look at the internal, we're going to look at the external world that a child can live in. Now keep in mind all the time, it's about viewing the world through the eyes that we had at that moment in time. So for us today, somebody may be rude to us in a shop might register as -1. But somebody talking to a child in that way, when they are completely defenseless, might register as a -9. It's always about how we perceive the situation, not how anybody else does. So the two environments for the external that a child could live in are: environment number 1, a child is in a healthy and safe environment. And environment number 2, a child is in an unhealthy and unsafe environment. Now, as we go further along into area number 3, you're going to see that, yes, there are physical needs, obviously, but it's also to include our emotional needs as well. Environment number 1, a child is in a healthy and safe environment. Now, as I go through these, all I can ever give is a generalized overview. You see, we will never live in just environment 1 or just environment 2. That's not life. It doesn't work that way. So sometimes we could be in environment 1 for 3 hours and then drop into environment 2 for 10 minutes and then back up to environment 1, and it will fluctuate continually throughout the day. Environment number 1, where a child is in a healthy and safe environment. So here, the child's parents or peers display very good self-esteem and confidence. They will be connected to themselves and the child. Yes, they will have stress in their lives because that's just natural to all people, but very often they can handle their daily challenges. They can also accommodate for the extra energy required to support the child. For example, the parents will feel comfortable with their child pushing their own boundaries to grow. Example, pushing boundaries could be slight defiance, as in the child screaming or throwing things, but all is done with a parent's healthy enforced boundaries. Now this can very often give a child a sense of connection and love because they understand that it's okay to express themselves, sometimes with slight defiance, and still be accepted. In turn, this can lead to healthy growth and confidence to then test more of their current reality, knowing that their survival, food, water, shelter and emotional support will still be supplied. Now again, this does not mean that the parent or peer or caregiver is totally without control, because here, if no control is exercised, then the child would have no guidance or boundaries, which could then cause confusion, which is then not healthy and not safe. However, the control and boundaries which will be projected onto that child will be comfortable without excessive force. So now let's take a look at environment number 2. A child is in an unhealthy and unsafe environment. Now again, keep in mind this can only ever be a generalized overview. Here, the child's parents, peers, caregivers will very often display low self-esteem and low confidence, and they will very often feel overwhelming or erratic sense of stress to the daily challenges of their life. Their caregivers' fight, flight or freeze reactions will very often be in regular use because they are very often struggling to cope with the extra energy not only to live their own lives, but to support their child. So here, if the parents begin to act in a controlling or rejecting or abusive manner, the child's protector self is naturally going to trigger to protect that child's health and well-being. The protector self is obviously going to do this as the child is dependent upon the parents or caregivers for their survival and security. Now, before we go on, I just want to mention there are two areas we're going to split this into. There is the physiological needs, such as food, water, and shelter, and then emotional needs. And again, I know I'm repeating myself here, but this can only ever be a generalized overview. This is a basic structure to which you can reflect your own thoughts on this, but this can never be specific. So here, if the child's survival of their physiology, food, water, or support is threatened in any way or restricted, then the child's protector self is naturally going to develop coping mechanisms to regain their balance. We're going to give an overview of these coping mechanisms, so they're going to be explained a lot more as we progress into further modules. Now, sometimes, as I mentioned in these coping mechanisms, and again, I know this is a sensitive area, but it is a generalized overview. But a child may try to adopt a coping mechanism to survive a very difficult time by not fighting back or not trying to defend themselves when they may be being degraded or physically beaten or ignored or abused in a whole multitude of other ways. And they will do that because the child needs the parents to survive. And as we obviously know, the child is in effect totally powerless to change their environment. We as adults know that children might have other options, but the child will never know that. And again, in some situations, not all, but in some, the child may not fight back at all if, for example, their parent shows aggression, abandonment, or other emotion manipulations. Because if the protector self of the child sees this, the protector self may become anxious of further violence or further emotional harm. Again, the protector self is trying its best to deal in a very difficult situation. So it is in this environment, the unhealthy and unsafe environment, that the foundations of the child's low self-esteem and shame could be created. Beliefs could be formed here, such as, I am dependent upon others for my survival, and I have to act to their desires or I could be harmed or suffer loss. And again, for us as adults to look at that, we might know that that is not going to happen. But through the eyes of a completely defenseless child, they might have a totally different perspective on the situation. So we have the external environment, environment number 1, healthy and safe, and environment number 2, unhealthy and unsafe. And then we have our internal representation of that, which is our peer idolization scale, how we personally interpret that situation. Again, this is why two people could have similar kind of experiences when they're younger, but have completely different perspectives. Now in a moment, we're going to look at area number 3 of the peer idolization scale and the experiences that we can have which cause us on a really deep level to start recording those videos and place them on the scale at a certain level. But before we do that, I want to refer back to that when I said the peer idolization scale can be seen as a ladder. Now there's a very important reason that see this as a ladder. If you're trying to climb a ladder, you wouldn't just jump from step 1 to step 20. That's impossible and it'd be very unsafe. And it's exactly the same with the emotions. Now I want to give you an example of something that happened to me when I used to go to these positive thinking groups. So I was at -10 a lot of the time, or if I was lucky, I was at -8. I used to feel deep resentment, hatred, anger, confusion. I was all over the place in my mind. I could barely hold my life together. But I used to go to these groups and we'd walk in and they'd play really loud music and get us all to stand up and scream at the top of our voices how we are going to be rich. We are going to be powerful. We are going to leave a legacy. We are important. We deserve love. We are, the list goes on. Now, although I used to keep going to these groups and screaming, and we would literally scream these things out loud, but what was actually happening when I was screaming these words was that I was feeling a deep sense of pain inside. And there's a reason for that. As mentioned, my mindset, my emotions, my inside my mind was at a -8, -9, -10. And then I went into that room and they were trying to say, get up there to a +10, +10, +10. So if you imagine, I'm at -8, and then all of a sudden I shift my energy to get to a +10. All it brought up in me was the thoughts that that's too far away, I'm never going to get there, it's too far for me to reach, and brought with it a deep sense of pain and suffering. And that shift in energy and pretending that I was at a +10 when really I was at the other side of the scale just served to amplify my own low self-esteem, thinking I'm never going to get there. And I actually ended up feeling worse after going to these groups. So one suggestion I always give, and it's only a suggestion because I'll never tell anybody to do anything, I only make suggestions. So a suggestion that really turned my life around was that if I was at a -8, rather than trying to jump to a +10 and end up feeling like I was going to fail, which would be the equivalent of somebody who's been bedridden for 20 years and then being expected to run a marathon the next day. If I was at a -8, what I looked at and my goal was to get to a -6. Now in the positive thinking guru world, they would say, no, that's wrong. You want to get to the +10, reach high, aim for the stars. But remember, all the way through this, I have said, take gradual steps. And also, the emotional world cannot be forced. If too many steps are taken too quickly, and for example, the protector self might have a fear of rejection because of a shame-based belief, then visualizing that beautiful, happy relationship where you're the center of attention by all your friends, your protector self might see all that as potential rejection. So again, this is just a suggestion, but when you're working with the emotions, take gradual steps. Although it sounds grand to make these big leaps, when I was a personal trainer, I would see it every single year. In January, people would flood into the gym. They would make these grand claims of how they're going to train 3 times a week and how they're going to lose weight or get ripped or whatever it might be. And then 2 or 3 weeks later, they would just stop coming. And it's exactly the same with this. If you push too hard and too quickly, it can sometimes reverse the effect. But again, that's not to say that will be that way for everybody, because everybody's different. But if you are just starting, my suggestion is start slowly and then build up. So in a moment, we're going to look at the third area, which is the peer idolization scale, stage 1 and stage 2. And this is where we can form these beliefs if we've been put into a difficult scenario, which is environment 2, we are not safe and it's not healthy. And then we may create behaviours and actions, or our protector self will do, to survive those difficult times. Now again, from the naive onlooker's point of view, or even from us as adults observing our behaviour when we were children, we may say that behaviour is irrational, or I should have done this. Now to give you an example here, when I was younger, my dad used to intimidate me in a whole variety of ways. And I was terrified to stand up to him because of a certain interaction that happened once. But even after he died, for many years later, I felt totally ashamed of myself for not standing up to him, even though I was at the time 5 years old. There is no way at all I could have ever done anything to defend myself against him at all. But even though the situation was that I could never have won at all, I still judged myself in a very harsh way. And as mentioned, a lot of people do that. They will take actions and behaviours to survive a very difficult situation or a time when they were very confused and they didn't know what to do. And their coping strategies could be to have backed down, and then a lot of judgment might come as a result of that. So keep that in mind when we go into stage 1 and stage 2 in a moment. So as mentioned again, the peer idolization scale is a theory that I've created myself and is therefore, like all psychological models, completely unable to be proven scientifically. The reason being, again, there are simply too many variables in each individual's human psychology. Remember, every person alive is living their own unique life. No two lives can ever be compared. So with a peer idolization scale, it can only ever be a structure that you can run through your own filter. However though, using the peer idolization scale as a base structure, we can then use conscious logic to gain a sense of a structure of how the mind constructs a person's world in their mind, the videos, using the comparison of pain and gratification. So we're now going to cover those two main stages that I mentioned that create belief structures when a person is a child. And these belief structures then create their own self-worth, their residual self-image, their own value internally. And this is on the internal cinema screen. And if those internal values or internal residual self-image or their self-worth is in the below the line section or the disconnection section, that is where a person can create a residual self-image of, for example, shame and guilt. Now remember, the next module is all about shame and guilt. So the two stages of the peer idolization scale are stage 1, birth, and stage 2, the pecking order. Now this is to be cross-referenced with the two environments that we went through before, which are external environments. These are that we are born into this physical world. And environment number 1 is safe and healthy, and environment number 2 is unsafe and unhealthy. So when we are looking at birth, we are physically born into that world. And then we have the pecking order, which is where we will be either placed or place ourselves in that hierarchy of our social environment. Well, keep in mind here, the more gratifying videos, the more positive outcomes, the above the line scenarios are not really what we're going to focus on. It's mainly where we learn the pain-based beliefs. And the main ones are that we're going to focus on shame and guilt. Now, shame and guilt will be formed when the child is actually, or perceives that they are, in an unhealthy and unsafe environment, and then compares themselves in a painful frame of reference to their peers. So if you imagine we as a person are in an unhealthy and unsafe environment, and then we see ourselves as lesser than all our peers. Now the environment that we are going to discuss here has the angle of the child and the peer in the home environment, which would insinuate a parent or guardian or caregiver. Now it is true that a parent or guardian can have a tremendous impact and power in a child's life, but remember also that a child can gain their perspectives of the world from many other environments too, as mentioned, such as school, other neighbours, other children, or very intense one-off experiences of trauma. Now please bear in mind that this module is also to be cross-referenced with the next module on shame and guilt. Note to bear. Also a point to note in this module is that I'm going to be mainly using the example of food, water and shelter as the child's primary anxiety in life. However, emotional abuse such as anxiety of rejection or abandonment or neglect can obviously be as traumatic to a child's perspective. But one thing to say as well, we have two angles here, which is our physiological survival and then our emotional survival. Now, there are many different types of debates on this, but one question to ask you to run through your filter is, if you were your own protector self and you had to look after food, water and shelter or emotional safety, if you were your own protector self when you were a child in a traumatic situation, which one would you focus on first? Usually it's the physical, because without a physical body, we don't have anything. But also, again, we need to acknowledge that emotional abuse can have devastating impact on a child's life. So going through stage 1 and stage 2. Stage 1 is birth. Stage 2 is the pecking order. So the peer idolization scale, stage 1, birth. The basic fact of life is that a child is born into the world and is presented with a body that they do not know how to use, a language around them that they don't understand, and a total lack of power in every way, shape and form. This then leaves the child completely dependent on the adults and parents who surround them in their environment. Now, what I'm going to say now is the perspective of the peer idolization scale. Again, if you want to run this through your filter and may have a different perspective, then feel free to do that. But for this module now, we're going to look at food, water and shelter as the child's primary aim. So the child or the child's protector self's primary goal is physical survival, which is food, water and shelter. And given that they are totally dependent upon those around them for these needs, thereby having no independence, it can leave the newborn at the mercy of other people's decisions for their physical survival. The peer idolization scale stage 2, the pecking order. Understanding that the child is completely dependent upon the parents or caregivers for their food, water and shelter, and it doesn't always have to be the birth parents, by the way, the child will now start to learn that they ideally have to work together with their parents or caregivers to get food, water and shelter, i.e. physical survival. Now, as mentioned, the food, water and shelter obviously is a physical need, but the child will also have a desperate need for the emotional self, and this obviously also requires a lot of careful attention. However, although the physical body cannot survive without food, water and shelter, over the years it has been largely assumed that the body can physically survive without emotional connection and emotional attention. Now that's one perspective, but it has also been recorded that situations of emotional neglect can create a level of pain leading to sometimes physical dysfunction. But for this perspective, and again this is a very sensitive area, but for this perspective, the need for food, water and shelter could still be a higher priority to the protector self of the two needs of physical or emotional. Now again, if anything I'm saying there may feel very sensitive to you, stop the training, run it through your filters and then carry on. Keep in mind this can only ever be a base structure. Now naturally, each child is usually born with a desire to explore the world, grow and learn about new things, and their emotional drive can usually start very high on the peer idolization scale, maybe +8, 9, 10. But obviously not for everybody. Unless for some other reason, a child will usually have a drive to connect to other people around them and their surroundings because this is the most logical method for their own growth and survival. Now here, we can class the child's emotional level as above the line. So remember this is 0 up to +10. And the reason for this is they may not have been exposed to any major challenges or traumas in their life. So in essence, they're a blank slate. But obviously this is always open for debate because children are born and have many different expressions. But as a general, if the child is above the line and they are vulnerable, they may not have had any experience in defending themselves, which most children don't, because they will be too preoccupied with food, water and emotional gratification. Remember how helpless we are as children. We are immediately looking to secure ourselves. Therefore, if that child comes into contact with parents or peers or caregivers who display personality behaviours, fight, flight or freeze, or environment number 2, unhealthy and unsafe, in the lower section of the peer idolization scale, 0 down to -10. This will naturally cause the child confusion and stress. Now, if their food, water or emotional connections are at threat, this will immediately engage their protector self and may then create a need to adapt to their surroundings to ensure their needs are met. Now, I'm just going to say that again because this is key. If their food, water, shelter or emotional connections are at threat, this will immediately engage their protector self and then may create a need to adapt behaviours, attitudes to ensure that their needs are met. So although a child might want to act in a certain way, if they realise that acting in a certain way is going to be a threat to them in some way, they may adapt their behaviour to another. Now, this is what we're going to go into in the next module, but this is where we have what's known as the true self, which is our natural self-expression. Or, if we feel a threat in some way, we become our conditioned self. And this is an adapted version of who we are in order to ensure that our needs are getting met. So just as a quick review there, we have stage 1, which is birth. We are born, we are completely helpless in every way. And then stage 2, the pecking order, that if we are around people who are displaying actions and behaviours of fight, flight and freeze, and that triggers our protector self, we may need to adapt our behaviour in order to ensure that we are safe. We might not want to do that behaviour, but if we realise that's the safest option for survival, we may be forced to do it by our protector self taking over. And as mentioned, we'll go into this in the next module, but this is the difference between our true self and our conditioned self. Next, we're going to look at the skill of rapport. Now, over the years, as I've been doing research on different training models, I've heard many different ways of rapport being described. So I'm going to describe here what it means in this program. Rapport is the ability to create close and harmonious relationships with people in the environment by working together. In this state, the members of the group will understand each other's feelings and ideas and communicate with each other in a connected fashion. And this, as you can see, is influence. Manipulation is where the person is only looking out for themselves. Influence is where we are creating rapport with each other for the greater good of all people. Rapport for a child or anybody who associates around other people is an essential trait of survival and connection. And it's driven from the logic that similar people connect and support each other. Remember, we as human beings are social creatures. It's in this stage that the child can begin to adapt their personality to their environment by creating rapport with either the parents, the peers, or other main influences in their life. And they will do this not only in the home, but also all the different environments they find themselves in. Given that the child has not yet learned about how to act and conduct themselves in their environment, because they're just children, in this stage they may begin to create a rapport by copying mannerisms of their parents, peers, or caregivers. And when they do that, they may start acting in the exact same way. Remember, as children, we don't know what's going on, so we're looking for the best way of survival. And you're going to see how this copy and paste attitude can have devastating impact in years to come when we go to this in further modules. Now, for the purpose of understanding this level of rapport in regards to the periodization scale, and more importantly the mask and the con, we're now going to look at how the mind can trap itself in a pattern of low self-esteem or shame or guilt or a whole array of unhelpful behaviours. And here we're going to look at rapport being created for one of two main reasons, or maybe both. Reason number 1 is to connect to other people in the group, thus leading to acceptance. That child will believe if they are accepted and wanted, their chances of survival and connection will dramatically increase. Reason number 2, usually unbeknown to the child at that time, they can learn, this is the way that I should behave in life to avoid pain. Remember back to the carrot and the stick approach. As mentioned, a child is completely dependent upon the adults around them for their survival, both physical and emotional. So rapport and connection to other people around them will rate very highly on their list of needs. If the child is unsure of their world through lack of knowledge, they may unknowingly copy the behaviours of those around them, assuming that those behaviours are a correct template for the best option of survival. As we all know, the mind of a child is very impressionable and is always finding new ways to understand or how to act, which then again leads to the best option of survival. And very often we can see people say, oh, that child is annoying or that child is demanding, but what we have to look at is through the eyes of that very vulnerable child. And behind that, we will have the child's protector self. Keep in mind at all times, if the child's protector self feels unsure of something in any way, it will create a conditioned self that we're going to look at in the next module, and the protector self will assume that that conditioned self is its best option of survival. Dropping down the scale. Given that every person alive is on their journey, and we all are, journey of emotional growth and self-discovery, it can obviously be an option where a child can be born to parents or be around peers who have low self-esteem, low confidence, or are in an environment where they are below the line most of the time. So this is 0 down to -10. Now this obviously doesn't have to be in all areas of their life. In some areas the parent or peer might be very self-aware, but in others they may struggle immensely. Yet, as mentioned, a child will also be learning about the world from all the environments in which they find themselves. Sometimes a child may be exposed to very loving and connecting environments, which obviously then create healthy and connecting videos of association. However, other situations in life can become a battleground with competition and violence everywhere. If the child and their child's protector self do not have sufficient skills to deal with these challenging experiences, and very few do, these experiences can then be stored as painful beliefs or the videos and then associated in their mind as pain and then placed in the lowest section of the peer idolization scale. Now, we've all been exposed to this through our lives, but for a child to be exposed to potentially painful environmental messages, that child only has to observe things like the news or a lot of the violent films that are around today. Now, I'm not a prudeist about these films, but some films nowadays are just pure gratuitous violence, and it's not needed, but it tunes into that anxiety that so many people have. I used to be addicted to those extremely violent films myself. Now, after working through my trauma, I don't find them entertaining in the slightest way. But now with the inclusion of the internet and phones, and children getting phones when they're very young, they can easily be exposed to painful environmental messages, which then is creating their map of the world very often without them realising. If a child was to be born into a below-the-line environment or environment number 2, which is unhealthy and unsafe, they will be subconsciously picking up on behaviours and habits of how to act and react in their environment. Now, when I was younger, because my perspective of the world was it was all about arguing, I would go into really nice places and unknowingly start arguments with people. And obviously then I would get asked to leave the places, and I was very confused. I didn't understand. And a lot of people can have this confusion happening in their life every single day. And as we mentioned in earlier modules, if left, picking up these behaviours and habits in the below the line section can soon enough lead to an inability to control their emotions due to their protector self continually taking control by engaging the fight, flight or freeze reaction. Very often this will be happening unconsciously for that person. All of which, by the way, is directly related to the mask and the con. Let's now take a live example of a projected future of somebody that was born into a challenging environment and then how that might unfold as they get into later years. For this example, we're going to take a person in their 30s who has now been employed for a while, and then suddenly, for seemingly no reason, but there's always a reason by the way, their manager starts to be rude to them, and then sometimes they will be ignorant, and then sometimes they will even be aggressive towards them. Now with this sudden shift of energy, if the employee had a shame-based self-image, remember shame is a belief that I am something wrong, the residual self-image. This doesn't mean it's fact, but that might be how they see themselves on their internal cinema screen. That could have been created from a challenging childhood environment, and then it could have been suppressed inside Pandora's box, so they wouldn't even be consciously aware of why they felt such low self-esteem. But in this scenario, it's possible that even though their manager is being abusive to them, that they could immediately give all their power to their manager. And if they were to do this, they may end up feeling very frustrated and confused because they know, quote, they shouldn't do that because, quote, it's irrational, but they feel compelled to do that unknowingly because their protector self has redirected their behaviour to survive a difficult situation because it might have triggered something from their childhood. So keep in mind again here, because we're going to go into this a lot, a shame-based self-image is an internal representation of who I am is not good enough. Then if they believe that they, as a human being, not their skills, but them as a person, are not good enough, this belief will then be used as a template for their protector self. Also, and this is a big area that we're going to spend a lot more time on further along, if the employee viewed their manager in a pseudo-parent role, meaning that that person might see their manager as their parent because the protector self's getting confused by matching internal reality and today and merging them together, the employee's protector self may still trigger their behaviour to act and react in the same manner that they did when they were a child. So now we take a person in the 30s who's skilled and capable, but then when their manager starts to be rude to them, they immediately become submissive and back down and consciously end up feeling very frustrated. And it is by looking at life in this way that we can start to understand why highly intelligent, creative and skilled adults can become trapped in things such as workplace bullying or domestic abuse, even though as an adult they have the power to defend themselves competently. Now also just to add in here something that I've also talked about, a very sensitive area there, when highly skilled adults can get trapped in workplace bullying or domestic abuse. I mentioned this before, but I want to go over it again because it is such a sensitive area. Sometimes when a person sees another person going through workplace bullying and then may seem not to do anything about it, or be in a domestic abuse situation and then seem not to do anything about it, the naive onlooker might say that person's being irrational. But again, it's vital that we look through the eyes of that individual. And I'm going to share something here which is relating to when I spoke before about the book that I got on bullying, and then it said, stand your ground, and the bullying went much worse. As mentioned, when I left school, I went to be an engineer, and I was terrible at it, and I didn't like the environment that I was in, and the people I was around were not pleasant at all. And when the bullying got worse, because I followed that advice in the book of that self-acclaimed guru telling me what to do, and it actually made my whole situation 10 times worse. what was actually happening at the time were some of the other people in the class were joking about murdering me. Now, I'm not saying, they were joking that, we're going to kill you at break, ha ha ha. They were actually joking about ending my life. Now, I won't go into detail of what was actually being said because there's going to be a limit of how much I share. But rest assured, I was being bullied. Now, although I was absolutely terrified going to that class, and although I wasn't sure if a, quote, accident might happen that could end my life, I still kept going back to that class. I was getting nothing from that group. When I was reading the books, nothing went in. I was totally numb. And I had the jokes about people ending my life, but I still kept going back to that class. I was getting nothing from it. I was terrified, but I still kept going back. And that is why when I talk about people who get trapped in domestic abuse, although from the outside it might seem like insanity from a naive onlooker, I know how it feels myself. For some reason, I kept going back to that class, even though I was scared that I might be murdered. And that's how confusing it can be when we get so scared. And that is because sometimes when our anxiety and stress hits a certain level, what we can sometimes do is the opposite of what we want to do. We become so afraid of breaking away from the abuse that sometimes we can stay in that environment thinking that we will stay safe if we don't make any decision at all. And the reason I wanted to share that again is if there is anybody listening to this who has been caught in that loop and maybe harshly judgmental of yourself, I've been there myself, and I remember thinking in my head, I'm insane. What's wrong with me? Why don't I just leave? But now I understand why. But when your anxiety and stress hits a certain level, it can feel very confusing to make a decision. All logic seems to go out of the window. Remember the questions that I asked you right at the very start of this program. Why is it that some very highly skilled people can work 80 hours a week and hate the job? Why is it that some very kind and loving people can end up in unfulfilling relationships or as unhappy singles? Why is it that some people who give and give and give and give and want to help other people as much as possible can sometimes end up flat out broke and miserable? Hopefully now it's starting to make sense as to why. To look at a summary of the loop pattern, because we're coming to the end of this module now, on the topic that the subconscious mind cannot analyse or update its own beliefs. The subconscious is just a library. It needs the protector self to work with the conscious mind in order to do that. If the above pattern of the employee having a challenging childhood is buried deep, say within Pandora's box, their conscious mind won't be able to see the pattern of the challenging childhood experience. Or they may know about it but not really emotionally connect to that. And this again is how people can appear to be unable to break free from unhealthy environments, such as painful job roles or abusive relationships. In an example of a person becoming trapped in a job role with an abusive manager, it may be that they believe, in their perspective, that if they were to move on from their current career or manager, that nobody else would ever want to employ them, or that they may be abandoning the company and then letting everybody down. This, as we now know, can often cause immense confusion for the conscious mind, which cannot see into Pandora's box. This confusion would appear because, as said, the conscious mind cannot see the logic of why the protector self and subconscious mind would allow this to continue. And again, it's through this confusion that people will claim that they have irrational behaviour. And then if we introduce the contrickster here, the contrickster will also use that as leverage, saying that person has irrational behaviour, meaning they are dysfunctional. And then the contrickster sells what they need to sell to stop our pain. But keep in mind though, the protector self will carry on protecting its beliefs and keep on protecting the mind just as it did when the person was very young. That's if they're in state recall. And it's going to do this again and again until the subconscious, or especially Pandora's box, is updated. I hope you can see now why simple mindfulness and generalized positive thinking techniques will only ever be a temporary solution, because these techniques are only conscious-based strategies. Yes, they can be very useful to keep us focused to use mindfulness and positive thinking techniques, but the mass market personal development will all claim that's all you need to do. And it's all back to that sugar and salt. If we do positive thinking and mindfulness, we feel happy for a few days, and that's the sugar rush. But we know what happened in the story of the sugar and salt. And how many people in this world do the simple mindfulness, the positive thinking, the jumping up and down in their chair, screaming that they're worthwhile and everything like that, but they might have a completely different residual self-image fighting them at every stage. Yes, they are worth it. Yes, they are valuable, but we have to see what the protector self sees. The peer idolization scale, again, is a theory to observe possible actions and reactions of children who then carry on those beliefs into adulthood. Understanding how the mind processes information is really essential if we're going to understand how vulnerable we can be in the mask and the con. As it's plain to see from the above analogy, a trapped emotion may continue to be replayed upon the internal cinema screen for the protector self to react, until it's updated. And remember, in some cases of trauma or limiting beliefs, further professional support may be required in order to release the trapped emotion. But again, I highly recommend this personally, but you have to do your research. Remember, working with the wrong person can cost you a lot more than money. So we've now come to the end of module number 9, the peer idolization scale. And you will have noticed all the way through this of my sensitivity of my words, saying continually that this can only ever be a guide. Because it's a model, it's not fact, but it's something that we can use to bring structure to why we may have created those videos in the first place. We can be born into a world and feel totally vulnerable. And if that environment that we are living in is volatile in any way, our protector self will want to survive. And when we go into module number 10 about shame and guilt, we're going to see about the true self and the conditioned self. And you're going to see how the conditioned self, although we may not consciously want to be that, our subconscious and protector self needs us to be that in order to survive potentially challenging, overwhelming situations. So for this module, I highly recommend stopping the training, going through all of your notes, cross-referencing it all with modules 1 to 8, and also be aware of any feelings that may have come up for you, because as I mentioned, we're talking about more sensitive topics now. And then once you've done that, I look forward to seeing you again in module number 10, Shame and Guilt.